righty, well, good evening, everybody. That was a lousy good evening. Good evening. All right, well, welcome back as we have our Sunday Night Theology series continuing tonight. And so as we announced this morning, tonight's topic will be technology and the Bible. And so we are delighted to have Dr. Keith Plummer with us. And so, but before we kind of get into the lecture itself and then the Q&A to follow, there's just a few giveaways, book giveaways that we want to go through. The first one is specific in terms of who gets this giveaway. And so this one is to go to a family with the most kids 12 and over. So I know we're kind of limited right now, but raise your hand if you have a child 12 and over. Nice and high. Okay. Who has more than one child? Keep your hand up. Is there an upper limit on that? Not necessarily. Maybe if they're moved out, we'll go with that. If they're moved out, then maybe keep your hand down. More than two children. More than 3 children. More than 4. All right, we got Scott. This one's going to go to you. This is the tech-wise family, and so the question is: could you do a 24-hour fast from your electronics? A week? What did you say? I said I've done it from food. You've done it from food, so maybe that. So this is making good choices about technology in our families is more than just using internet filters and determining screen time limits for our children. It's about building character, wisdom, and courage rather than accepting technology's promises of ease and instant gratification. It's about developing our heart, mind, soul, and strength when we're tempted to settle for entertainment and consumer satisfaction, and it's definitely not just about the kids. Okay, so that was the first one. The second one is From the Garden to the City by John Dyer, The Place of Technology in the Story of God. Technology is not simply an invention of the computer age. It is, in fact, a foundational part of being human and extends back to the very beginning of creation. But the way we interact with it has fundamentally changed. In this fully revised, updated edition, John Dyer examines technological reality through the lens of Scripture, gleaning insight from the best thinkers on technology, theology, and culture. He reveals how technology left unexamined can enslave us, yet understanding it with spiritual vision, the way God intends, is totally transformative. All right, so who promises that if you take this book, you'll read it within maybe the next year? Dave, it goes to you. All right. All right, we got one more. And let me just say this. I'm going to confess something. Obviously, this weekend we have our youth retreat on a very similar topic. And so I might have taken a couple of these books home to read some of it and make sure I didn't damage it for you. This one particularly, I didn't get too much into the one I just gave Dave, but this one was extremely eye-opening to me. It is based off of Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, I believe. And so this one is called Scrolling Ourselves to Death, Reclaiming Life in a Digital Age. It's written by multiple authors and contributors, one of them being Dr. Keith Plummer. And so a phenomenal book kind of talking about the ways in which digital technology is reshaping our world and warping our minds. The onslaught of social media and smartphones has brought an appetite for distraction, an epidemic of loneliness, and increased rates of mental unhealth. For Christians, the digital revolution has profound implications for spiritual formation and mission. How should believers respond to the theological and discipleship challenges of the scrolling life? And so this is very practical, wise, even good for small groups, as noted by the book. So who will read this within maybe the next year? Bryce? All right. Why don't you meet me halfway? And Bryce will be teaching one of our sessions this weekend. All right, well, at this time, I'd love to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Keith Plummer. So a brother in Christ who is husband to Ingrid, and glad that she can join us this evening. And they have 2 children. He is the dean and professor of theology at the School of Divinity at Cairn University. He regularly teaches apologetics and technology and Christian discipleship, and has been teaching at Cairn since 2010. He also hosts Cairn's podcast, Defragmenting. He is a fellow of the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. He has a BA in Health and Society from Brown University, holds an MDiv with emphasis in apologetics, and a PhD in systematic theology from Trinity Evangelical School. He previously served on the pastoral staff of Our Saviour Evangelical Free Church in Wheeling, Illinois for 18 years. For 10 of those years, he served as a volunteer police chaplain. He is published in Scrolling Ourselves to Death, Reclaiming Life in a Digital Age, Before You Lose Your Faith, Deconstructing Doubt in the Church, and The Digital Public Square, Christian Ethics in a Technological Society. And so it is our delight to welcome Dr. Keith Plummer as he brings tonight's lecture.
Thank you very much, Josh, and good evening to you. It's a pleasure to be with you. I am very, very encouraged by the fact that you are a church that hosts events like this, having been in pastoral ministry myself and now in higher education on both fronts. I am really, really excited that you take theology seriously and not simply as an academic or intellectual exercise, but because you know that theology is important for Christian life. It is to be lived. It is to be marveled at in terms of the glory of our God. And I am really, really excited to know that your youth group is going to be doing a retreat on this topic of technology and following Jesus. Because, as we are going to discuss, this is an issue that I think is among some of the foremost matters of necessity for the church to address in terms of helping one another to grow as followers of Jesus in a dizzying climate where we are bombarded with information, we are bombarded with things that are calling us to be less careful in our thinking, and by a number of things that are distracting us and taking our attention away. As Pastor Josh mentioned, I do teach a course at Cairn called Technology and Christian Discipleship. And every semester I begin that course by giving out index cards to the students. And I tell them, I want you to anonymously complete the following sentence. I would describe my relationship with technology as blank because blank. And I wanted to share with you just some of their responses, and these may be some that you might resonate with. I would describe my relationship with technology as a dependent relationship. Society today is built in such a way that technology is a necessity. I am not saying that you cannot survive without technology, but I do not think it would be easy. It has become a social norm to use technology, therefore I am dependent on it. Another student said, I would describe my relationship with technology as something I use a lot and depend on for various things. It can be beneficial at times, but also not beneficial at all. Another student describes their relationship with technology as frustrating. I want to use screens less in order to be present, but our culture has gotten to a point where smartphones are used for almost everything. I struggle with guilt when I don't engage in digital communication to keep up with family, absent friends. I kind of wish I was born in the 70s. Normal, because I am a college student, which requires a lot of time using my laptop and tablet for school. I use technology an average amount. Balanced, because I don't overuse it. I'm not addicted to it. But a large part of my life revolves around it because it's so integrated in today's world. I mostly use it for education purposes and for enjoyment and fun. Unhealthy. This is why I have them do this anonymously. Unhealthy because I overuse it and its features to mentally numb, drug, self-medicate. It's often an unhealthy escape from my real issues and troubles. Confusing and overwhelming because we are bombarded with an overwhelming amount of ideas. This can result in confusion in our identity and the world around us. Complicated, because for as much as it simplifies some aspects of my life, it also makes them more confusing. A double-edged sword, because it has become something I utilize for good in my life with the potential of causing me harm as well, based on how I use it. And I want to skip to this last one there, because that's a nice segue into what it is that we're going to be talking about. This student said, confused because I grew up not caring about advancement. I was alongside those who said, if you can, you should. But as a practicing Christian now, I am a bit lost. Scripture is not crystal clear about everything. I need wisdom. And that's why I want us to talk about this subject tonight, because as the student says, if you look in your concordance for technology, you will be disappointed, because that word won't appear there. If you read through the Bible and you look for that word, you're not going to find it. But that does not mean that the scriptures do not speak to it. And that is what we are going to look at tonight. And we're going to start off with this idea of what is it that we mean when we speak of technology at all. Probably the first thing that comes to your mind is the devices that you use on a daily basis, whether it be your smartphone, whether it be your headphones, your AirPods, whatever. And that is part of what technology is. Usually when we think of technology, we think of it as being something that is electronic. But that would be too narrow a view of what technology is. Our word technology comes from a Greek word, techne, which simply means skill, art, or craft. And when we think about how that word is used, or words relevant to it or like it, when the people of Jesus' town say of him, is this not Joseph the carpenter's son? The Greek word that the gospel writer uses that we translate carpenter is tekton, and it means an artisan, a craftsman. It is used sometimes of carpenters, but not exclusively. So Joseph was an artisan, a skilled worker, a craftsman. But when we think about technology, there are various layers of technology. And here I am going to refer to something that a philosopher of technology named Carl Mitchum wrote about. This is something that John Dyer addresses in his book, From the Garden to the City. And I'm just going to go through these rather quickly, but I want you to see that when we think about technology, it is much broader in scope than what we might be prone to think. The first thing that comes to mind, obviously, is the idea of technology as object, the devices that we use. But that's the first layer. Another layer of technology is technology as knowledge, the know-how, the expertise that is required in order to create and make use of the various technological objects. That, too, is a technology of sorts. And then there is the activity, what it is that humans do, the practice of making and using tools. And finally, there is technology as volition or will. Why is it that people are making and using the tools as they are? The human will, the intention, the values that drive technology. And so technology is a broad subject. We are going to be focusing largely on the issue of the objects, but also the activity and the volition. And we want to do this from an explicitly Christian perspective. Now, I was glad that John Dyer's book was one that was given away, because it is a required text that I use in the class that I teach on technology and Christian discipleship. And in it, John Dyer provides what I think is a helpful definition of technology from an explicitly Christian perspective, and this is how he defines it. He says that technology is the human activity of using tools to transform God's creation for practical purposes. So you see how he has included the idea of the activity as well as the tools. But he says this is what technology is. If we're going to think about it from a biblically informed perspective, technology is a human activity of using tools to transform God's creation for practical purposes. And you might hear that and wonder, well, why might I want to transform God's creation? After all, we read in Genesis that God created and he assessed what he created, and he says, it is good. But this idea of transforming God's creation is not necessarily bad. I'm going to make the case that I think that it was part of God's intent. Because though God created things good, he also created things with potentialities that he intended to be developed. So, for example, when you follow a recipe and prepare a delicious meal, you are doing technology. You are transforming God's creation, those good meats and vegetables and all of that other stuff, not because you think they're bad, but there are latent potentialities in them that as you work with them, you are bringing out and accentuating. And so this idea of a human activity that is transformative of God's creation, I believe, is actually embedded in what sometimes is called the cultural mandate. When God created humanity, he blesses them, and we read in Genesis 1, verses 26 and 28, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. This mandate is called the cultural mandate by theologians because they see in it God's calling of humanity to cultivate what it is that he has made. Now, that means that technology is not something that arose on the scene post-sin. Technology is actually God's creative intent. Dyer says, for example, in his book that the first technology he believes is language itself. As God called Adam to name the creatures. But as you go through the redemptive story, you see that technology is used from the very beginning. We do see, post-fall, that when the man and the woman became aware of their nakedness after their rebellion against God, what do? They seek to cover their nakedness by sewing together fig leaves, covering their loins, seeking to deal with their shame, which we learn is an inadequate measure, but nevertheless, that was technological activity. They were transforming God's creation in terms of the fig leaves for the practical purpose of seeking to solve the problem of their shame and their nakedness. The technological activity in itself was not problematic. The motive for their doing it was. But that they were seeking to do technology, be creative, that in itself is not a problem. There is, we read in Genesis 11, the account of the Tower of Babel. The construction of a building with the motive of let us make a name for ourselves, seeking to reach to the heavens. And, lest anyone wonder, the Tower of Babel almost certainly did not look like this. I just like the picture. But again, we have technological activity. In a chapter titled Technology and the Story of Redemption, Being the People of God in a Mechanized World, that is in a book called Are We All Cyborgs Now? Reclaiming Our Humanity from the Machine. And let me just say something. I'm going to mention a whole lot of books. So lest you be one of those people who gets anxious about getting them all down, at the end, I have a resource list for you. All the books that I'm going to mention are on that list. So breathe. We're okay. All right. So in this book, Robin Phillips says this: while Babel was a rejection of the Edenic vocation, it was also an attempt, as are all utopias, to recreate Eden. Instead of spreading out over the earth in small societies, man stayed in one place to accumulate power. Rather than using technology in ways that are restorative, like the garments of skin, man used mechanical arts concentrated in the ungodly city to enhance human power beyond what is safe and wise. And we could go through the biblical account and look at other instances in which God employed human technology in order to work out his purposes. We could look at Noah's Ark, for example, or we could look at the craftsmanship and the skill that was used in order to create the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, the beautiful, glorious clothing of the high priest. But there is another technology that perhaps you haven't thought about as a technology that is central to the redemptive story, and that is the cross. The cross was a piece of technology for the purpose of execution. It was a work of skill, but it was for the purpose of death. And God chose to use it in order to bring about salvation. So, technology is not in itself post-fall, though the fall clearly has impact on technology in terms of development and use. And so we want to think about technology through the lenses of creation and fall. We will also talk about seeing technology through the lens of redemption and even consummation, but I want to just camp out here on looking at technology through the lenses of creation and fall, because I think that doing so can keep us from some opposing errors. In a book called Creation Regained, a biblical basics for a reformational worldview, Albert Walters makes a distinction between what he calls structure and direction. And what he means by this is the following. Structure refers to what it is that God has created that makes it what it is. And Walter says that even after sin entered into the world and creation experienced corruption, and even human nature experienced moral corruption, nevertheless, there was a recognizable structure that remained and that was still good, even though there was distortion. This is what Walter says. We may say that sin and evil always have a character of a caricature. You know what a caricature is. It is a humorous depiction of someone where there are recognizable features, but there are exaggerations. There are things that are out of proportion, but you still are able to recognize who this is. That's what makes it, in some ways, humorous. But that's not his point here about humor. He's just saying that sin and evil have the impact of a caricature. That is, of a distorted image that nevertheless embodies certain recognizable features. A human being, after the fall, is still a human being. A humanistic school is still a school. A broken relationship is still a relationship. The point that he's making is that there is still a structure of God's good creation, even with the distorting effects of sin. Think about this. The very practice of literal idol making, which the Old Testament over and over again prohibits and condemns. There is a recognizable structure of God's creative intent even in the fashioning of idols, because it involves skill, artistry, imagination, craftsmanship. That's the recognizable structure underlying the sinful trust in something other than God. And so that brings us to direction. That the direction has to do with whether or not something is being subjected to God and oriented towards Him or away from Him. And I think that if we properly understand technology with respect to creation and fall, this will prevent us from two equal and opposite errors that we are prone to. The first one is demonizing technology. Demonizing technology, by that I mean having an attitude towards technology by default, it's just bad. It is something that we should reject. It is something that is intrinsically evil, perhaps. But then on the other extreme, if we don't take seriously the impact of sin on how it is that the human activity of technology is affected, then we can run the risk of devouring technology. And by devouring, I mean having an uncritical rush to make use of anything and everything new, simply focusing upon what pleasure might I derive from this? How much faster might I be able to do something with this? And so a Christian view is going to avoid demonizing technology, recognizing that it is rooted in God's creation, or devouring technology because there is a realization of how it is that sin has played into things. Now, depending upon where you are, it may be that one of these errors is more prone for you, but I have a tendency, and one of the reasons that I started teaching the class that I do at Cairn is I think that by and large, we are more in danger of devouring technology than demonizing it. That's not to say that there aren't Christians who do demonize it, but I think overall we tend to be more in need of guarding against the other. And so we want to be aware of something having to do with the inescapable, transformative, and shaping power of technology. John Culkin is known for this saying, "We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us." We create tools, and through their use over time, there is an inescapable shaping that takes place on us. I started thinking about this subject years ago when I was in pastoral ministry, and I read, and I must apologize for I know that you can't read all that's up there because in translating from my PowerPoint to the Chromecast, we had some difficulties. But I read this article in The Atlantic, and it was by a man named Nicholas Carr. It was called, "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" This was from the July-August issue of 2008. And just to give you an idea what's going on in the illustration, the police car there is labeled as Internet Patrol, and the sign there says minimum speed 186,000, so however many more miles per second. That's the speed of light. And apparently, this man did not meet the minimum speed because he's walking. And so he's getting a citation. The point of the illustration is, if you are not keeping up with our lightning fast environment, you are transgressing. And in this book, Nicholas Carr talks about what is called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity has to do with our brain's amazing capacity to create new neural networks in response to habitual activity. In order to enable us to better accomplish certain things that we're doing with regularity, new neural networks are formed, and in their formation, there is the degradation of other neural networks. And in the book, Nicholas Carr described the impact. Now, this was 2008. In the article, Nicholas Carr described what he noticed in himself since he went on the net. And it had to do with just his ability to think. And he says this: "Over the past few years, I've had an uncomfortable sense that someone or something has been tinkering with my brain, remapping the neural circuitry, reprogramming the memory. My mind isn't going, so far as I can tell, but it's changing. I'm not thinking the way I used to think. I can feel it most strongly when I'm reading. immersing myself in a book or a lengthy article used to be easy. My mind would get caught up in the narrative or the turns of the argument, and I'd spend hours strolling through long stretches of prose. That's rarely the case anymore. Now my concentration often starts to drift after 2 or 3 pages. I get fidgety, lose the thread, begin looking for something else to do. I feel as if I'm always dragging my wayward brain back to the text. The deep reading that used to come naturally has become a struggle. And then he had the following sentence that paints such a vivid word picture, and with which I had to say, unfortunately, I resonate with this. Once I was a scuba diver in the sea of words. Now I zip along the surface like a guy on a jet ski. Can anyone relate to that? I read that and I thought, he just described me. I grew up loving to read. I could stay down in a book for a long time. Early 2000s, late 1990s. I noticed that there was a real change. That what used to be easy wasn't as easy. The desire to be distracted after maybe a page and a half or 3 was greater. Now, Nicholas Carr is not a Christian, but he was pointing to something that I think has great significance for us as followers of Christ, and that is this. What he is dealing with here has to do with attention, and how it is, in this case, his acclimation to life on the net had degraded his attention such that he found it very difficult to attend for any length of time. And then I thought, the first thing, well, what is the significance of this for Bible study? For being able to meditate upon the Scriptures, to read lengthy portions of Scripture at one sitting. But then I thought, well, wait a minute, this attention issue has bearing not just for reading of Scripture, but it has bearing for practically every dimension of Christian life. Prayer. Easily distracted. Loving my neighbor. Because if I am accustomed and habituated to constantly seeking and craving stimulation, entertainment, the next new thing, it's going to be really difficult for me to love you well when you're not entertaining, when you are maybe boring, or at least I think you are. Attention is integral to love. And if we are called to love God with our whole heart, soul, strength, and mind, and to love our neighbor as we love ourselves, then forms of life that degrade our attention are actually at odds with our obedience. And my point here, and I'll say this over and over again, my point here is not making use of technology is in itself sin. That's not it. My point is here we've just got to pay attention to how our use of technology may be forming us in ways that could be counter to what it is that we know God has for us. And on this point of the formative power of technology, I have been particularly helped by Neil Postman, who was mentioned with respect to scrolling ourselves to death. This is another one of his books, Technopoly. And he says there, the question, what will a new technology do, is no more important than the question, what will a new technology undo? Indeed, the latter question is more important precisely because it is asked so infrequently. Note what Postman is saying. The question of what will a new technology allow me to do is the one that is first on our minds when we learn about a new technology. We think about all of the ways that it is going to enhance our lives, enable us to do the things that we want. And Postman said, well, everyone's asking that question. But the question that is so infrequently asked is, what will this new technology undo? And he says that question is even more important because it's so infrequently asked. Postman was known for the saying, technology giveth, technology taketh away. What he meant by that is, yes, there are benefits with any technology, or most technologies, it gives. But what we're often unaware of is what it is taking away. And so there is this transformative shaping effect that is inescapable in certain ways. Think about it this way. You use a shovel. You want to dig a hole. You may want to dig a hole in order to bury a loved one. You may want to dig a hole in order to hide a body that you killed. Two very different uses or motives for the shovel. But as you use the shovel, and you use it repeatedly in such things, calluses are going to form on your hands. Regardless of what your motive is, there is a feedback from the tool that shapes you. That's a physical example. Nicholas Carr is looking at some of the cognitive ways, and we should be looking at some of the affective ways that our various technological uses, particularly our digital uses, are shaping us. Alan Noble wrote a book called Disruptive Witness, in which he says that the two major challenges to Christians in trying to make the gospel heard by our secular world are secularity and distraction. And he says that even for us as Christians, we are in need of being on guard against that. In that book, he says, to live well in a modern world requires constant reassessment of how our society and technology are shaping us. We should be open to taking drastic steps to reject practices and habits that we believe are destructive and evil, but the vast majority of innovations will not be so clear-cut, and we will have to weigh benefits, purposes, and damaging effects individually and in community. And we're going to be talking about that communal aspect a little bit later. Jason Thacker, who the youth group is going to be going through his curriculum, Following Jesus in a Digital Age, in that book he says, we live in a world of incredibly advanced technologies that are challenging our perceptions of what is real and what we know to be true. Each and every day, it seems, these digital innovations present us with new challenges which affect not only how we interact with our neighbors, but also how we follow Jesus. Whatever our questions about life in the digital age, it is becoming clear that technology is deeply shaping each of us and those around us in unique and at times concerning ways. And then he says this, wisdom shows us that the question before us in the digital age is not if technology is discipling and shaping us, but how. and to what extent? Michael Sakasis is another believer who writes and thinks, I think, deeply and well about the impact of technology on society. He has a Substack called The Convivial Society, and in one of his articles, he had this to say: "To be human is to both shape and be shaped by the world we inhabit. But what is the shape to which our tools and devices encourage us to conform? Who or what do we seek to please by the way we use them? Do they sustain or erode our humanity? These are the questions we do well to ask." But these are the questions that we often don't ask. And why is it that we don't ask these questions? I came up with a list that I can only go through rather quickly, but one of the reasons that I don't think that we ask these questions is because as evangelicals, we tend to be very pragmatic. Pragmatism is the idea that you simply do whatever works or whatever you think is going to work. And for that reason, evangelicalism has usually been on the early adopting side of new technologies, radio, television, and so forth. And I'm not saying that we should not make use of any of those, but if we're only driven by the question of, will this work, we're not going to ask the kinds of questions that Michael Sakasis says we should. Our technologies, particularly our digital technologies, have acclimated us to frames of mind and ways of thinking that make it very difficult to reflect about them. What I mean by that is this: if our mind is constantly trained to think shallowly, to skim quickly, then the kind of reflection and meditation on the impact that our technologies may be having on us is not going to be well practiced. Also, we don't ask those questions because we derive some measure of pleasure and convenience from our technologies. And that's not necessarily bad, but sometimes I don't want to ask the kinds of questions that Michael Sakasis is saying that we should, because I'm fearful of what the repercussions might be. Upton Sinclair is known for a quotation that is one of my favorites. "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding." And when it comes to our technologies and the impacts that they may be having on us, there are some things maybe I don't want to understand because I've got vested interest. But also, I think we don't ask the kinds of questions that Sakasis says that we should because of social pressures. There are ways of life that are expected given our technologies and how normative they have become. This is a meme that some of you may have seen at one point. There's a guy in this coffee shop sitting at a table, not on his phone, not on a laptop, just drinking coffee like a psychopath. Why is that humorous? It's humorous because we know that there was a time, or many of us know, that there was a time where just sitting in the coffee shop, drinking coffee, not being on a device, just sitting there was seen as normal. But now, if you do that, you're suspicious. You're not following along with the way things are. And there is a real social force that is at work in terms of the decisions we make with respect to our technologies and how we use them. Alan Noble, whose book I mentioned before, says, "When I find someone who has no social media presence, I oscillate between admiring their defense of privacy and deep suspicion that they are hiding something. You're not on Instagram? You don't have a Facebook? You're not on X? What do you have to hide? There's the expectation that everyone is supposed to be in. Now, I want to say something about this idea of neutrality. I am saying that technologies are neither inherently good or evil. And what I mean by that is this. To attribute moral praise or condemnation to a device doesn't make sense. This is not a righteous phone. This is not a wicked phone. In that respect, it is morally neutral because wickedness and righteousness are attributes of agents, of people. This is not an agent. But here's where Christians tend to err. We tend to think, well, because it's neither good nor evil, then it's neutral. And I am going to say, no, they're not neutral. If by neutrality you mean that our technologies don't incline us towards certain directions as opposed to others, I'm not speaking necessarily morally here. But this is something that Postman said, embedded in every tool is an ideological bias, a predisposition to construct the world as one thing rather than another, to value one thing over another, to amplify one sense or skill or attitude more loudly than another. On the same plane, Nicholas Carr, in his book The Shallows, which was the book developed from the article that I mentioned before, says every tool imposes limitations even as it opens possibilities. The more we use it, the more we mold ourselves to its form and function. In other words, our tools point us in directions. They prioritize or privilege certain things. Joshua Pauling, co-author of the book, Are We All Cyborgs Now?, says this: new technologies tend to eliminate other ways of knowing and being, while directly impacting what ideas and habits people consider to be possible, plausible, and palatable. Technology is not bad, but is also certainly not neutral. We all intuitively know this. As the old saying goes, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That is, having the technology of a hammer in our hands can impact and alter our perception and behavior. Having a hammer in our hands doesn't deterministically make us hammer things, but it tends to privilege one mode of interaction over another. You start thinking about what it is you might hammer because you've got the hammer. Of course, to deny that tools are neutral is not to say they are evil, only that they mediate the world to us in unique and distinctive ways. It is not morally evil that most technologies are biased toward right-handedness, but it certainly isn't neutral. Hence, when we approach any technology, we must develop a self-awareness that enables us to see where it might be nudging us. That kind of awareness is what we want to do. Nicholas Carr again says, an honest appraisal of any new technology or of progress in general requires a sensitivity to what's lost as well as what's gained. We shouldn't allow the glories of technology to blind our inner watchdog to the possibility that we've numbed an essential part of ourself. So we want to be reflective. We want to be appropriately analytical to see not only what is it that can be gained, but what is it that we might lose. I'm going to skip through some things for the sake of time and say this. Because there is a social pressure, because there are social dynamics at work, there is a necessity, if we are going to do this, to rely on more than simply individual willpower. A lot has been said about something called collective action. How it is necessary for groups of people who recognize the need for this kind of reflection to band together and to aid one another with respect to encouraging one another to resist the tide. This is an article that appeared in Christianity Today several years back by Bonnie Christian, The Spiritual Battle of Teen Screen Time. And she, in this article, says, this is not just a matter for legislation, though I am glad that there are things that are being done in that regard. But she says this is a discipleship issue, that it really is ideal for the church to address. And she says this, that brings us to the church. Unlike the federal government, a local congregation is small enough that a no smartphones for kids agreement can be realistically implemented and enforced. And of course, there are no constitutional constraints on this kind of voluntary, communal rule of life. And unlike a single family, a local congregation is big enough that parents wouldn't be left to tackle this problem alone, and teenagers wouldn't be isolated from a social center all their friends enjoy. Of course, this kind of congregational pact wouldn't be a panacea. Most of us have friends and family outside our local church, which means many parents would still have to contend with competing norms among school friends, cousins, neighbors, and so on. It would also require a seriousness about committing to a church-wide standard of behavior that many congregations simply do not have. Legalist, fundamentalist, Luddite, you'd hear it all, because this is a legitimately difficult proposal in our culture. Now, and I'm not necessarily proposing what she is saying there, but I want you to think about the necessity for helping one another think through these things. Lest it be thought that I am advocating some form of Amish thinking, I am, to some degree. Because I think the Amish get the bad rap of being anti-technology. They're not anti-technology. I mean, for the reasons that we just discussed. Even the buggy is technology, according to what it is we've said is technology. But they're not anti-even computer technology. This author, Michael Perroni, in his Substack article said this: the Amish design a life first and then incorporate the tech that allows them to live that life. But we integrate technological advancement first and allow it to direct, distort, and at times even destroy our dearest designs. See, what the Amish do, even if you disagree with the conclusions that they draw, they think about what is the life that we want and what might this technology do that would be damaging to it. I don't agree with all of the decisions that the Amish arrive at, but I greatly admire the thought process that is going into the things that they're doing. More than data, we need wisdom. The world, in its technological flurry, says that the way out is just more information and faster speeds and being able to store it in great capacity. I am not opposed to data, But woe to us if we believe that what we really need is data as opposed to wisdom. The people of God need wisdom. The world, in opposition to God, needs wisdom. In his book, Knowing God, J.I. Packer called wisdom the power to see and the inclination to choose the best and highest goal together with the surest means of attaining it. Wisdom is to recognize how it is that reality is and to subject oneself to it. And we know from the scriptures that wisdom begins with the reverencing of God, the fear of the Lord. That is the beginning of all wisdom. Samuel James, in another excellent book called Digital Liturgies, says this: the essence of true wisdom is to live fully aligned with ultimate reality, practical, ethical, and theological. To the extent that anyone is wise, he sees himself, the world around him, and God for what they truly are. And what James says later on in the book is this, that biblically, wisdom is embodied. Part of recognizing the reality of things is to recognize oneself as a creature embodied, living in God's world, his good world. And James goes on to say that there is much about, particularly the internet, that encourages us to see our embodiedness and our limitations as things to be overcome, rather than good things to embrace. Therefore, it works against the formation of wisdom. In the online age, he writes, our default is to lose touch with reality. Left to ourselves and our machines, we find that wisdom often looks foolish, virtue often looks evil, and God often feels invisible. Every person living in a modern, digitally connected culture is constantly inhabiting a moral and intellectual habitat that distorts the biblical story of reality. This is a picture that I came across not too long ago. These two apparently robots, father and son, how that would be, I'll leave to your imagination, but they're in what seems to be a museum. And if you were to look at the displays going down the hallway, there are skeletons. There are no humans here, but they are looking at a brain, a human brain, and the dad is saying to his son, and that is the original processor. Now, there's so much going on in that picture. But when I think about it, what it makes me think about is a tragic irony. And that tragic irony is this: we become enamored and fascinated by machines that are capable of simulating humanity, while simultaneously failing to marvel and to wonder at being human. That ought not to be, and particularly in the age of AI. This is a very, very grave danger. What it is that we are capable of creating with AI is wondrous. But there will never be any creation of humanity that will exceed the glory of humanity. What is man that you are mindful of him? When we get to the point of so extolling the creation of our hands and looking with boredom upon image bearers. We are in a very dangerous place. I'm going to close here because I want to spend time with you with questions. And this is from this book by Craig Gay, Modern Technologies and the Human Future. Gay is a Christian author. He says, and so we must ask, are our technologies enhancing ordinary embodied face-to-face relations, for example, by creating and or protecting time and space for them? Are our devices making these relations more vivid and meaningful? If they are, then we ought to use them with deep gratitude. If, for example, we find that our use of social media makes us more attentive to the needs of others, then wonderful. We should use it gratefully. Yet, if we find instead that our technologies are undermining our ordinary, embodied, face-to-face relations with each other, then this should give us pause. It may be that technology is interposing itself between us, making our communication less fluid and our interaction less meaningful. Now, I had a QR code for this slide, which somehow expired. So I couldn't do that. So I did the next best thing, and I made this URL. If you want to take a picture of that URL, this should take you to a Google Doc, which consists of a number of books from Christian and non-Christian sources that I just keep a running list of that I think are very, very helpful. And also some episodes with some of the authors of those books related to technology that I had the opportunity to speak with for the podcast that Pastor Josh mentioned, Cairn's podcast, Defragmenting. My email address there is on that document as well. If you have difficulty with that, please let me know, and I will be glad to take your email and get it to you. But thank you for your attention. And now I would love to hear some things from you and do my best to try to respond to questions or thoughts that you might have in response to anything that I said.
Just so you all know, Grace wave her hand. Yeah, there's Grace in the back. She has a microphone, so she can come around for any questions that we have. But I thought I could just start with one. It's something I wanted to talk about in our last session on the spring retreat. I think about oftentimes growing up what my view of heaven was, and I think of when we talk about embodied community, not isolation. Like how would you speak into? I don't know if you've been aware of like how certain people view heaven kind of like disembodied.
Oh yeah.
That, how does the hope of the new heaven and the new earth, speak into this as well?
Yeah. Oh man, there's so much there. Okay. I do think that many Christians are operating with a sub-biblical view of heaven, where the ideal, the hope, is conceived of as being kind of ethereal, disembodied, like that, rather than resurrection, which is the Christian hope. We just celebrated Easter, the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And he is the firstborn from the dead. John Newton, who is one of my favorite theologians, the author of the hymn Amazing Grace, he said that Jesus' resurrection is the promise and the pattern of our own. And so what does that have to do with this? It means that for Christians, for us to prioritize means of communication and see them as better than actually being present to each other, I think that we're living out of sorts with our profession about the goodness of creation and the goodness of embodiment. And so, one of the people that has impacted me. Some of you may be aware of the name Sherry Turkle. She wrote a book years ago called Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other. And she followed that up with a book called Reclaiming Conversation. She's not a believer either, but she said that in her research of looking at the impact of digital communication on society, she was hearing people say across generations, "I'd rather text than talk." And you compare that to like John in his second and third epistles. He says, "I have more to say to you, but I would prefer not to use pen and paper. We will see each other face to face, and our joy will be complete." And when I heard her say that, I thought, there is something about our narrative, the Christian story, that should lead us to think of, use, and design technologies in different ways. When Christians fall into the same kind of attitude of, "I'd rather text than talk. I'd rather have a more disembodied distance relationship than one that is present," there's great problem. So there's more that could be said in there, but that's part of what I would say to that.
Thank you. If you have a question, just slip your hand up and Grace can come bring you a microphone. Bryce.
Always have a question. First of all, thank you for addressing this extremely important topic. Not only to you, but to everyone in the church. I view this as the peak moral issue for our society and then also for the church. You could go 1,000 directions with the topic as a whole. And I think it's important to parse digital technology into intentionally addictive interfaces and interfaces that are not. So I'll give you an example. I have an online account where we have a couple of rental properties. I have to pay the electric bills at the rental properties. I go onto the internet, there's a screen, I log in, and if I put in my bank information once and hit auto pay, I never have to go get a check, I never have to go get a stamp, I never have to log back in. The account automatically draws from my designated bank account and pays the electric bill. And I, because of that, have a few more moments to be present in my home and present with my family and present as a neighbor. This is an example of a digital technology that actually allows me to be more physically present. And in that sense, I think it's a good one. But the other side of the spectrum is websites like TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and a whole host of others are actually engineered the same way that slot machines are engineered and with the same exact purpose. They execute varying dopamine and cortisol levers that they pull on you, and the objective is the same: keep a butt in a seat for as long as possible. So with casinos and slot machines, they want to keep you there because you'll spend all your money eventually against the house. With Facebook, with Instagram, etc., they want you to be online and engaged as long as possible because they can sell your attention to advertisers. So I just want to parse that. There's a difference between PPL's automatic login website, which is mediated by the internet. It is a digital technology, and the technology that's intentionally engineered to be addictive to the user. And I think it's important for churches to understand that distinction, and also to give that distinction to kids. It's why they handed down a court ruling 2 weeks ago against YouTube and against Meta, because they're realizing this is similar to like giving kids cigarettes in the 1970s. The data at this point is overwhelmingly negative about what happens to kids' brains when they're engaged with these intentionally addictive interfaces. No one seems to be addicted to going on the PPL website and checking their accounts there. So I was wondering if you could comment on that, but I also want to agree that this is part of what we're going to say to your kids if you have kids in youth group at the church on this retreat. Josh and I have discoursed about it. for at this point multiple hours, because there's so many directions you could go with it. But that's just one that I'm mindful of. I'd like to hear if you explored that the different parsings.
Sure. I'm glad you brought that up. And the rulings against Meta and YouTube recently have been, I think, good, because they have shown that there's more than just a question of the content, but as you were bringing out, design and what the motivation of that is, which is to keep people on it. That said, I would also say, though, even when we're not dealing with addictive issues, the questions that Postman asks of what is taken away is still worth asking, even of those good technologies that you mentioned. So, for example, and this is one that I remember, because I'm old enough to remember. I'm old enough to remember when online giving became a thing. There's a lot of benefits to that. But one of the drawbacks is that giving as a corporate practice, as a church body, is virtually no more. And so there was something. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that for this reason, but I'm just saying that when this came about, I didn't hear anyone even asking about that. There is something, for example, when our kids were young and they saw mom and dad putting stuff in the plate and they saw other people doing it, there was something that was formative about that now has become much more privatized. And my point is not that online giving is sinful, that's not it. But I'm saying of any technology, I think that we should get more in the habit of asking not only what does this allow us to do, and what it allows us to do, is that good? What is it that might be affected by this? But I do agree with you concerning the design features of those platforms. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Plummer. Really enjoyed the lecture. I was wondering if you could comment on concerns in the area of AI and then transhumanism as well. I work for the Department of War. I kind of see concerns over here with AI, but could you elaborate both down at our level where we live and then also kind of big picture for our nation, so AI and transhumanism?
Okay. We talk about both AI and transhumanism and posthumanism in our class, and we have some really, really good discussions about it. Let's start with transhumanism. Transhumanism is the idea of continually enhancing human being by technological means. That can be technological means in terms of the integration of computer technology with the neural system. It could be pharmacology. That's, pharmaceuticals is a technology. So cognitive enhancement through the use of pharmaceuticals. And the underlying premise of transhumanism is that we are the forces of evolution and that our limitations are intrinsically bad and things to be overcome. And so one of the things that I didn't really talk about is there's a necessity to distinguish between redemptive uses of technology. By redemptive here, I'm not meaning it in a limited form in terms of the gospel. I mean redemptive in the sense that there are some technologies that can, for a temporal manner, be effective for countering some of the effects of the fall. So, for example, medicine is, in many respects, it can be a redemptive use of technology. One of the things we talk about in our class is virtual reality has shown some very promising uses in treating PTSD, for example, with people who have been in combat overseas, and the use of virtual reality in a controlled counseling setting with a professional has been very liberating for many people. And there what you see is a technology being used to help someone live as they were intended to live in the real world, as opposed to virtual reality being used as a means of escape. So the transhumanists believe that humans are capable of being involved in our own evolution, so to speak, by the introduction of various technological interventions. And there is the idea that limitations are to be exceeded at all costs. Transhumanism is to result in what's called post-humanism, the idea being that we can form ourselves into something that is beyond what we currently know as human. If you deny that there is a design for human nature, then you're going to seek to push the limits at all bounds. There is a difference between using technology for enhancement and using technology for, say, rehabilitation or restoration. And the transhumanists, I think, they see any exceeding of limitations as good. And I don't. For AI, that is, man, there's so much. My concern about AI is that obviously I'm concerned about it with regard to education, because I think that AI is leading many to what's called cognitive offloading. You must learn some basic skills before you are able to make competent use of artificial intelligence. What I see going on in K through 12 and the university troubles me greatly. But beyond that, the concern that I have with AI is the degree that people are using it as a counterpart, whether that be a romantic partner, a counselor, using it as a substitute for actual human relations. So that's scratching the surface of your question, but I hope it's of some help. But that's a very important issue.
Thank you, Dr. Plummer as well. So I appreciate what you're saying about just evangelicals being pragmatic and adopting things maybe too quickly at times. So in your studies, or just even in personal, as you've gone about in your years of being in ministry and such, what are some maybe other areas that, as a local church for us, the universal church as well, but more maybe in a local church setting, we should be cautious about things we're adopting into our church and how we're using it.
Very good question. I think particularly pastors and Bible study teachers and so forth need to be really guarded in terms of the use that they make of AI, particularly LLMs, in terms of the research, but especially the crafting of lessons, sermons, so forth. Because just as we were talking about the cognitive offloading, there is something in the struggling with the biblical text that is not only beneficial for the one who is delivering the word, but it's formative for the one who is engaged in that. I'm very troubled by the number of Christian companies that are selling their wares to pastors with saying, like, use AI so that you can really be about the business of shepherding your people. The time that you spend as a pastor poring over a text, praying over it, doing the hard work of working through a text, its meaning and its application, that's for the benefit of you and your people. There are administrative things that I think that AI is very good for, and that I don't have any difficulty commending to like a local church to do it. But I think once we get into the area of relying on AI for things that are most appropriately we should be relying on people for, then it's problematic. Does that help at all? Or okay? But I'm glad you're asking that question. There really does need to be more thought given by ministry leaders to this.
In the back here, and then maybe we can have the last question over here.
Hopefully this is a simple question. I was wondering what your thought is on using the Bible as on our tablets and our computer for technology instead of just opening up our Bibles.
That was a simple question. Easy. I won't say it was a simple question. It was easy to ask. It'll be more difficult to answer. But it's an important question because there is research that has been done to show that the medium by which you encounter a text has impact upon things like comprehension, retention, and things like that. John Dyer, who has been mentioned already, he did his dissertation on the area of evangelicals and the digital Bible. And he wrote a book called People of the Screen. And he shows that it makes a difference how it is that you interact with the text. Now, I think that what I would say is this. You lose some things when you are screen reading. For example, there's a phenomenon that I'm sure most of you are aware of. When you're reading any book, I'm not just talking about the Bible, you know where something is located on the page, what side it was on, and so forth. All of that contributes to your comprehension, your recall, and so forth. With a screen, you don't have that. And there's also, I think, a greater continuity or a seeing of connections when you have a physical book than when you have a screen as well. That said, there are advantages of screens, especially for those of us whose eyes are getting weaker. And so there are some things that I read on my screen that I can enlarge, and I really like that. But I wouldn't say that one should not use it at all. But I would say that there is something about screen reading in general that encourages skimming. That's just a fact. The more you read on a screen, the more you are going to be skimming as opposed to doing deep reading. If you are going to read on a screen, I would say you should read on a devoted screen, like an e-reader or something that isn't connected to notifications and so forth. Or if you are using an iPad or something like that, when you do read on it, you turn notifications off, you turn the Wi-Fi off, things like that. So there are differences. I don't think that a physical book and a screen are merely interchangeable without any consequences.
Last question.
Thank you. I'm 26 and I have a lot of godly friends who are seeking to love the Lord. They're seeking to ask these deeper questions that you're encouraging. But I think our generation, and definitely even more so the one below, is more deeply entrenched in some of these addictive interfaces than previous generations are. So most of my mentors, most of my pastors aren't dealing with quite the same battle with technology as I think that I am and my generation is. So I wonder if there's, in all your studies of technology and its impacts, have you come across resources or language that's helpful for just combating the very real, just day-to-day resistance of those pools that are there.
Okay, could you just repeat that last part, because I'm not sure if I understood the resistance.
Resistance to the draws of these addictive platforms that we know, we've asked these deeper questions, we know they're not healthy for our spiritual formation, but we can't seem to stop ourselves.
Yeah. This is why, well, here, let me give you some encouraging news. It seems as though Gen Zers and below, but particularly Gen Zers, are becoming less enchanted by it. There are groups. There was an article in the New York Times this week. Gen Zers are using AI, but they're not happy about it. Where there are more people who are saying, you know what, I'm fatigued by this digital life. And I'm encouraged by that. Even at the level of high school, there are groups that are calling themselves Luddite groups, where they are meeting together to do things like board games or just read together, and you've got to put phones away. And this is just self-generated. These are high school students who are doing this because they are overwhelmed and tired, and they realize there's got to be more than this. I'm trying to think of a resource that I would suggest there is a book called The Anxious Generation that is written by Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. And Jonathan Haidt is a professor at NYU, and he's an atheist, but he has been on the forefront of the global move to have school-free phones. Oh my goodness, we got that already. Phone-free schools. His book, The Anxious Generation, is excellent. And I think that something like that, when people read that and read his description and they see themselves in it, and they're doing this together, not just by yourself, I think that can be part of the movement. For young women, there is a woman in the UK named Freya India, Freya. Her last name is India. She has written some of the most helpful things about Gen Z and technology, not just technology, but she's got a book out now called Girls, and that is another resource that I would use. And just in closing, I'll say this. A number of the people that I have mentioned, Jonathan Haidt, I didn't mention Tristan Harris, who is the founder of the Center for Humane Technology, Sherry Turkle, Alone Together, she's an MIT professor, many others that I could name, Nicholas Carr, none of those people are believers. And one of the things that really got me interested in this is this. All of these people are rightly pointing out some really troubling things about the impact that various technologies are having on society, young people, and society at large. But they don't have the story that makes sense of that. We do. We have the biblical story that tells us what humans are, who we are for, and under what conditions we optimally thrive. But we, in large part, were not on the forefront of this. We should be. And we should be embodying lives that are curiosity driving in terms of how it is that we collectively make use of technology. Some of the decisions that churches make with respect to technology, you can tell they haven't really done much deliberation about this. And so I would really like to see Christian voices, and there are increasingly more of them, so I'm glad about that. But when I think about the people who have sounded the alarm most voluminously, they're basically people who hold to evolutionary views about humans, but yet I'm grateful for, by the common grace of God, the things that they have identified and said, there's something wrong here. But it is only Christians that really have the ultimate answer. And we need to be speaking into those things much more than we are. And I hope that something like this will be instrumental in equipping you to do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming. Let me just close our time in prayer. Thank you all for coming out this evening. Definitely thank you to Dr. Keith and his wife Ingrid for coming out to join us this evening. Heavenly Father, Lord, we just thank you so much that you are the God of wisdom and that you have spoken clearly in your word, God. And we just thank you for nights like this where we're reminded that these conversations should be happening in the church. Help us to lovingly, with humility and with wisdom, to talk through these things. God, I just think of how often we can easily become a people who don't think. Critical thinking goes out the door in an age of too much information. I pray that you would just help us to think upon these things, not just to rush into things, but to think wisely. Help us to shepherd well. Help us, for the few in here who have young children, that we in our homes would be discipling and shepherding in these ways. And no matter what generation we are, help us to see the ways you're calling us to grow, that even maybe the older generations here could be a means of pouring into the younger generations in the church. God, help us to be a people who are devoted to you and your word and the gospel. And I just thank you for your goodness and grace towards us in Christ. In his name we pray. Amen.